Welcome to My Business Matters, the Michigan Chamber podcast.
Hello, I'm Wendy Block, Senior Vice President of Business Advocacy for the Michigan Chamber and today's podcast host. We're going to be taking a closer look at something called carbon capture or carbon storage. We'll discuss what it really is, how it works, and why it's a fast-growing part of the environmental and energy future. Joining me today to help demystify this important topic are three folks in the forefront of this work. The first is Rich Bowman, Director of Policy for the Nature Conservancy in Michigan. Our second guest is Ben Grove, the Senior Manager of Carbon Storage for the Clean Air Task Force, and our very own Mike Alaimo, the Michigan Chamber's Director of Environmental and Energy Affairs. We've got a lot to cover today, so let's get things started. Let's maybe start with just some background of our stakeholder guests, your organization, and what you do. Rich, could you lead us off? Just tell us a little bit about the Nature Conservancy and your work there.
Sure. The Nature Conservancy in Michigan is a business unit of the planet's largest not-for-profit conservation organization. We actually have existed since the early 1950s. We work in 81 countries all over the planet and all 50 states. The core of our mission is to keep nature whole and healthy and functioning, both for nature itself and for people and the benefits we get from nature.
Okay, great. Ben, how about you? Can you just give us a quick elevator pitch there?
Yep. So Clean Air Task Force is a global nonprofit climate NGO, and our mission broadly is to decarbonize the world's economy by advocating for pragmatic policies and advanced technologies that we believe will play a key role in decarbonization. And one of those technologies is carbon capture and storage. And so much of our work around CCS historically has been focused on developing federal policies that catalyze commercialization of CCS. And now we're also focusing on state-level policy. And I'm a geologist by training. I've been working in this field for about a decade now and actually have some experience in some Michigan CCS projects, so excited to be here.
Great. Thank you. Mike, hopefully our listeners are familiar with the Michigan Chamber. So let's kind of jump into today's topic. I think it's probably safe to say there's still a lot of confusion out there about what do we mean when we say carbon capture or carbon storage, really what it is and how it works. And there's a acronym that is floating around on this. We call it CCUS, or in other words, carbon capture, utilization, and storage. So maybe you can help our listeners break down this issue and really understand why this is important, why it's important to the Michigan Chamber, and maybe some examples of where these technologies are currently being deployed to help paint that picture for our listeners.
Yeah, Wendy, thanks so much. As you know, the Michigan Chamber membership is full of companies that want to be good stewards of the economy, of the environment, and the communities that they're hosted in. And so, more recently we're hearing about carbon capture as an important technology that can help decarbonize our industry, particularly heavy emitters and the manufacturing and heavy industrial space. And as Ben kind of pointed out, it's one tool in the toolbox, right? It's important that we're looking at a suite of options for how we take a more sustainable approach to economic development in our economy. And carbon capture is going to be an important part of that. And so fundamentally, what it looks like is, you're capturing that CO2 from an emitter, right? So whether it's a steel foundry, making steel, or auto parts, or cement manufacturing, or natural gas generation, and you're refining that CO2 to a specific pipeline specification and liquefying it, and ultimately pumping it deep below the Earth's surface to, in many cases, permanently store it so that it's not going into our atmosphere and not something that is going to contribute to the emissions profile of that facility. So really important for a number of our members that want that opportunity to either build a carbon capture facility themselves or opt into a program where they can sequester their carbon dioxide emissions.
Okay, so it sounds like there's a lot of great opportunities for this technology. Is it safe to say it's still very much emerging?
Yeah, I think, what we've seen is the technology has been out there for a number of years. It has really, we've seen a fundamental shift in the ability to do carbon capture economically with, the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act and the expansion of the 45Q tax credits. That's really been a game changer for the ability to go out and do this. And so that's where our members have had some increased interest.
Okay, so Rich and Ben, I'm going to ask you to jump in here. What do you think the current state of the Michigan landscape is for capturing carbon? And is there a reason that Michigan is uniquely positioned to move forward here?
Well,
maybe Rich, you start?
Let me start, and then because Ben's a geologist, he'll be able to really get to that second part. But we are potentially positioned to take advantage of this because we have a number of industries that as part of their process, they produce CO2 that could potentially be captured. It takes an infrastructure to do this. So we not only have to have the folks who are producing it, we have to have then the technologies that capture it and, as was referred to, concentrate it or liquefy it. We then, the place where those facilities are located is not necessarily the same as the place that's geologically appropriate to store it.
Okay, yep.
And so then we also have to move it, transport it, and that likely is talking about pipelines. And so there are, this isn't a done deal. We are, as an organization, we are strongly supportive of figuring this out, recognizing that it may not be appropriate for every application or in every place.
Sure. Okay. So Ben, Rich mentioned that you've got to liquefy it, you've got to store it. Can Michigan do all of these things?
Yeah. So I think one really unique thing that Michigan has going for it for CCS is the geology in the area. So you have to have the right rocks to store the CO2 in. And while there are places all around the U.S. that have that, not everywhere does. So Michigan is situated on top of a sedimentary basin called the Michigan Basin. And there are numerous geologic formations that are suitable for permanent storage. Some of them are already proven. And there's a lot of great work going on right now at the Geologic Survey to unlock these opportunities. In fact, Michigan's really the site of some really foundational work in CCS that has occurred over the past couple decades. CCS is already happening. There's a project with Core Energy in northern Michigan where they've already stored over 1.5 million tons of CO2 in geologic formations that is CO2 captured from their natural gas processing facility. It's the equivalent to about annual emissions of 320,000 cars. And all this work was funded by the Department of Energy, and there's been a huge partnership, a lot of foundational work that has gone into proving up the potential of the geology in the state to sequester CO2, and at this point, it has been proven. And so I think that's a unique aspect that Michigan has going for it.
Okay, so yeah, that's interesting. So Rich kind of mentioned that this isn't a done deal, right? And where do we think we are kind of in this space now? In terms of how do you move this forward? What are the barriers? Is this even scalable or cost effective? Kind of what does that crystal ball kind of look like on those things?
I think all of those questions are situational. So first off, it depends on where the carbon's being generated, how much it costs to get it into a state that is clean enough and transportable enough to put in the ground, and then getting it to that spot and putting it in the ground. That's just going to depend.
Okay.
The other thing that will drive that, though, is what develops as we continue to move forward in either the regulatory space related to carbon or in the price that the market is willing to pay to have carbon sequestered, because it isn't free, it costs.
Yeah, sure.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I mean, I think Rich said it well. It's going to be situational depending on the type of project, the developer and how they're approaching it, and of course the geology that they are testing and proving to make the sequestration work. Certainly this is, we've got a lot of members that are interested in investing in this space, but this is going to be an investment. And so with any business venture, there's going to be uncertainty associated with it. What we know is that, as Ben said, we have some very conducive geology formations in Michigan that have shown, and hopefully will continue to show that carbon capture is suitable for the state. But of course, you pointed out, Wendy, there are barriers in order to get this going. First and foremost, the chamber, alongside with coalition members like the Nature Conservancy and Clean Air Task Force, are working on legislation that we're hoping to bring in front of the legislature very soon here that will allow Eagle to have the regulatory program they need to permit and oversee carbon capture projects. And so this has been something we've been working on for a number of months now. It has been some time that we've been working on this, but we feel that we're finally getting those final stages of drafting, and we can move forward. Of course, when and where the legislature does pass the bills, you're going to have the problems or the challenges that you typically run into with any large development project, right? Community acceptance is going to be key. Educating the community on why this is important, why this matters, having the relationship between the developer and the community they're trying to, build a facility in. Those are going to be fundamental things that we're going to continue to work on.
Yeah, interesting. So how does this kind of fit then into, I guess, on one hand, you have this legislative effort, and I think there's a lot of legislators and industry that are interested in minimizing emissions and decarbonization and that sort of thing. Like, is this a key piece of that? And absent action on this, is that going to make those goals that both government and industry have that much harder? Yeah. Is that a fair way of looking at it? So, yeah,
and would love Rich and Ben to weigh in as well. But, I think for us, you can go and build apply through the EPA to build a carbon capture facility right now, right? Mm-hmm. What is lacking, though, are some state-specific, regulations that, we believe the state should be in the driver's seat for, their own, economic and environmental destiny, right? So just important that the state is kind of driving these key decisions. But then there's also implications on, where revenue comes from or where it goes, right? So, for our legislation, it's about, making sure that there are appropriately set fees for the department to facilitate the program, but also to have a legacy fund so that the department can continue to monitor sites going into the future, right?
Yeah.
Where and when we're able to build these projects on state land, the DNR will be able to auction off state land and subsurface rights, similar to how they do for oil and gas operations, and that's going to be revenue that goes into the Natural Resources Trust Fund. So, the Michigan DNR and Michigan Eagle have been very supportive in pursuing this legislation so that they can, have the authority to regulate carbon capture in the state. And Eagle has officially applied to the EPA in order to have that delegated authority. This legislation would allow them to have, the program so that they could have the delegated authority.
Interesting.
Mike touched on something, though, that's a really important part of this whole conversation that we're just having to have, because what we're talking about is putting a product underground, under land that's owned by somebody forever, which is a really long time. And people will expect to be compensated for that,
sure,
including public entities. And what that compensation looks like to agree to do this forever is still a topic of discussion.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, Ben, anything to add to that?
And I think just from, if you're a developer of a project, we already talked about this, investing significant amount of capital. There's significant amount of OpEx. These are big projects that require a lot of cash. And so when you're trying to go through the permitting process, which already takes a while, and seeing if everything pencils out, these key state policy uncertainties, like who owns the pore space, what the fees will be, where is liability, who does it go with, for how long, things like that. Uncertainty means risk. And so from a developer standpoint, getting those sorted out means de-risking a project. And I think it's really important on that side as well.
Yeah, interesting. So back to maybe this legislation, and that's the goal here, right, is to get legislation passed so there is more certainty around this. Anyone want to speak to just kind of the general timeline for action, what legislators are hearing as they learn about this and try to wrap their heads around this like I kind of am?
Right. Yeah, certainly we have been on a mission to educate lawmakers for some time now, as we've continued to simultaneously work on getting the legislative language ready to go. Those conversations have been really productive and I think constructive. We hope that the legislature will give this every consideration as we move into the end of the year and crazy lame duck season, right? So anything can happen, and that's both a risk and opportunity for getting this legislation done. But we do expect it to come before the Senate Energy and Environment Committee in the not too distant future. And at that point, we hope it will continue to move through the process.
But a pretty broad range of stakeholders, right, that are kind of pushing for action. I mean, the chamber, both of your groups, I believe some of the labor groups are on board. Like, do we feel like that is going to be helpful, that there are a lot of different stakeholders who maybe come at energy and environmental issues maybe from a different vantage point, but are somewhat united on this? Or
the thing I think we have to be careful of is there are a couple things. One is that a lot of folks are learning about this. And again, we're talking about figuring out how to do something that's going to have long-term, decadal, maybe millennial consequences. There are challenges both with carbon capture and storage, or we're involved a lot as an organization in what we call natural climate solutions, which is actually using the natural world to pull carbon out of the atmosphere and store it. And the one concern about mechanisms in both of those spaces within the environmental community is that they are a mitigation to an emission. The emission continues to occur, and they believe it slows down just getting rid of the emission. And the challenge, that argument is factually correct. The challenge with it is twofold. The first one is that we simply don't have the technology yet to get rid of some of these emissions, and so our option is to mitigate them as we develop those alternatives. The second one is one that often is not recognized because there's a lot of discussion about net zero and getting to net zero by 2040 or 2050 or whichever year you've chosen. If you actually go and read the reports related to the International Panel on Climate Change, getting to net zero is only the first step. We're going to have to eventually develop ways to pull carbon that we've put into the atmosphere in the last couple centuries back out of it. And so even if we didn't have any emissions, which is probably not going to happen, we still have to be thinking about how we do carbon capture and storage through both technology and through natural systems.
Gotcha. Okay, Ben, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I completely agree. And, everyone has, wildly different opinions on where carbon capture and storage can and should have the most utility. But at the end of the day, there are industries with process emissions, as somebody mentioned earlier, and we're going to need a lot of green cement and steel production to build out our net zero carbon economy. And carbon capture can help get us there, especially on some of these industries like cement that have process emissions that you can't just simply electrify. But agree with what Rich said.
Yeah, one of my favorite examples, and this discussion is happening a lot farther west of us, is a lot of folks have strong opinions one way or the other about biofuels, particularly ethanol. But ethanol is made in a natural refining process with bacteria, and the primary emission from that is CO2. Now, it's a very clean CO2 that you can capture and put into the ground, but the process of making that clean fuel results in CO2 emissions.
Yeah.
Right, which is a great point, because I think that's where we see some really great synergies between how carbon capture kind of takes us to that next, phase in decarbonization. Ethanol is a cleaner, fuel source, has CO2 as an emissions profile. Now, if we were able to capture that CO2 profile, you're looking at net zero ethanol refineries, and that's good for our agriculture community, but that's good for all the members we have out there that want to see more sustainable fuel options as well.
Yeah. So we're kind of running towards the end of our time here. Ben, I'm going to start maybe the last question with you. What's one big trend or thing that you're watching on carbon capture, or one thing that maybe you're working on for the rest of 2024, or maybe something we didn't cover? I'll leave it to you to decide.
Yeah, I'll just quickly raise an issue that we didn't quite get to cover in detail, and I'll briefly mention it here. But some of the work we've been doing, is you look at carbon capture. Obviously, there's a climate benefit from reducing carbon emissions, but there are additional co-benefits that are possible with carbon capture, and that is these industrial facilities often emit non-CO2 pollution. Think criteria air pollutants like SOx, NOx, particulate matter. The process of carbon capture requires essentially an operator to remove those pollutants from the flue gas to make sure that the capture system actually operates efficiently. And so we've done some work modeling, the potential health benefits and criteria air pollutant reduction associated with carbon capture and storage. I think that's really key messaging, along with the risks, and having an honest conversation about that. Having a conversation with relevant stakeholders on what are the co-benefits. I think also job creation is a big point here that we didn't quite get enough time to get into, but I'll just flag that Rhodium Group has a really great study from last year on the economic benefits of carbon capture over the next 15 years in Michigan. They look at near-term opportunities if they were all to be pursued, how much private investment that would garner, and the number of jobs created. And it's a pretty big number, so recommend checking that out.
Yeah. Okay, great. Rich, why don't we...
quick thing I'm going to be watching is not just in Michigan, but across the country and the globe, how the discussion continues to evolve related to the pricing of carbon and the regulation of carbon. Carbon has a price right now. I mean, we're, as an organization, I have carbon offsets available for folks to buy, and I would say, in a very round number, carbon's $25 a ton. That is, for many of these technologies, $25 a ton isn't going to make the technology by itself feasible to do carbon capture and storage. I know we, on one hand, hate the idea of regulation. Right now, one of the things that's really slowing this down is the uncertainty of not knowing whether or not there's going to be regulation and what the rules of the game are going to be.
Yeah, because businesses create that certainty, right?
That's right.
Like, you don't want to get started only to find out that now something else has changed.
The biggest barrier for me selling a carbon credit right now is companies who say, I really want to do it, but I don't want to do it if a year from now I'm going to have a regulatory compliance requirement and this carbon isn't going to meet that requirement.
Yeah, and that's a fair concern, right? I mean, you have to take that risk analysis into account. Yep. Mike, finish with you?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think we're laser focused on moving carbon capture legislation. There's a whole list of other issues that we're going to be watching as the legislature, continues to meet after the election and through the end of the year. And I think the probably topics for another day with this podcast even.
Yeah, exactly. So as always, our time goes by so fast. A very special thank you to Rich, Ben, and Mike for sharing their insights today and updating us on carbon capture. And thank you all for listening. Tune in next time and subscribe and like our podcast for easy notifications. Until then.